Well, I think we're now being recorded. So, hello. You're Ed Simon. I recognize you. I know who I'm talking to today. Essayist, belletrist, literary critic, diplomat. Well, maybe we can leave that bit out. How are you doing?
I'm good. I like Bill Letterist. I think that's great. I've
Yeah.
never I've never had that before, but I'll take it.
So, for those watching this, listening to it, there is a small person in the vicinity whose name is.
His name is Finton, but we call him
Uh,
Finn. Sorry, that's my son. He's 2.5 years old right now, and he sort of runs the show sometimes.
right.
Not this show in particular, but my
He,
show
wa-
of life.
he wasn't a scheduled guest, but of course his commentary is welcome at any time.
He just dropped in. He decided
Yeah,
to
yeah.
just
No, well,
come
I mean,
by.
it's like one of those, during sweeps week, one of those celebrity drop-ins that they used to
I
have
think
a
what I
week.
might do is I might move the computer to the playroom, and I'll just walk with you. And maybe he'll be a little bit more on point with that.
Well, in a sense, this is a welcome change of pace. You see, one of these conversations was with Michael Robbins. Now, that's only on the Substack page because he's a very shy person in one sense, though not in any number of other senses. And so he doesn't like the unfinished quality of his impromptus going up on YouTube for all the world to see. So his conversation with me is the only one in this group that's behind the paywall, and he did a lot of walking about, and
Okay.
and I thought it had a nice uh, informal feel to it. But as I say, he's deeply concerned that he not come across as a babbling idiot, although we all do at
Oh,
times.
I embrace it. I just lean into it for myself.
Well, I should hope so. I should hope so. Um, so, as I said, I've described you as a literary critic. I mean, that's what you write about, literature. And despite the cheerful manner with which you conduct yourself, obviously over Zoom, everyone's looking at you and saying, what a sweet, cherubic guy." In fact, you can be a fairly hard-edged writer at times too, or if not that, you can project an absolutely enchanting air of world weariness, one that makes me worry for your long-term psychological health, of course, but that until such time as it becomes an issue, remains a fairly appealing kind of aspect of your prose. But we can't begin if we don't address the elephant in the room, since we've already addressed the child in the room. We can address the
Sure.
elephant, which is your telepathic robbery of my plans for my essay on what constitutes good English prose, and how you then took what you had plundered from my unconscious mind by whatever sorcery you employ, because as we'll get to, you've written about sorcery and magic and
I do.
evil
Yeah, I've got
and
some
that sort of thing.
occult connections there.
Yeah. And then had the audacity to put much of it in an essay of your own called Punic Encomium, a style guide, which was the appendix to your book of essays, Binding the Ghost, whose cover it's kind of hard to show when there's any ambient light because it's kind of a ghostly cover. So,
It is. I've always been very neutral on that cover. Part of me really likes it, and part of me feels like it just sort of disappears into things. But I mean, we writers have little say in what our covers end up looking like. So
yeah, I mean, that's actually been a sore point with me over the years because the covers and also subtitles, in fact, sometimes titles. Before I had sold enough books in this world that I had more discretion in these matters, I had titles and subtitles routinely applied to things I wrote. That, in fact, when I wrote for magazines, no one ever changed the copy, the text, because let's be honest, You'd have to be a fairly exotic character to be able to figure out what I'm saying to begin with, let alone to edit it. But
Sure.
right, but they would always change the title. It's like they had to do something. You know, um,
I know that's like the big editorial prerogative, it seems, is that right to have like absolute control over the title. And it's gotten me into trouble before, actually, quite a bit.
really, can you give any examples? Like
I did, and some of your listeners might actually be familiar with this. I had one of my first big pieces was something that I wrote back in 2015 for a smaller site that covered religion and culture, but it got picked up by Salon. And what the piece was an Easter time meditation on the harrowing of hell. And when Salon, as is their wont, I suppose, as kind of a sometimes clickbaity site did, they retitled it as, quote, the secret history the church doesn't want you to know. And I thought, oh no, this is going to be very bad for me. And it was. I had a couple of months of very angry emails from folks who read the title, I think, but not the article. And that was kind of like my baptism by fire into public writing.
I'm sorry, but I'm unimpressed. I've courted hatred from the devout in ways you can't imagine.
That's true. No, I was young and in grad school, and I think it was a neophyte's introduction. Yeah, it wasn't as bad as it could have been, but it was surprising to me at the time, I think.
I'm beginning, though, to think that the legal suppression of religion is not a bad idea. Uh, I think
I'm
you
going to
have.
quote you on that. I mean, like David Bentley Hart says.
Yeah, I know. I've said, and that will now go out, and there will be little legions of neo-Thomists, whites. Uh, that's okay. The good thing is that some of that I can edit out. I record the soundtrack separately. I'll ask you to do one favor. Is there any way to adjust the lighting at your end because your face is now a mass of shadow?
Yes, one.
I'm not saying that's not
One.
an improvement. It might be.
Sure.
But,
1 second. I'm actually going to get my charger as well. Buddy, could you stop?
okay, and then I will start talking while you make your exit, so that the camera will focus on me, since I've got speaker view on here, and then no one will know that you vacated your chair. No one will know that you don't hear. Oh well, I did my best, obviously. Um, and I'll cut this out later. That's better. No, you don't have to.
Okay, awesome.
You don't have to abandon your son to the wolves, though. If you're worried about it, keep him near at hand.
I will. I hear we have a very small third floor, so I can hear him over there. I don't think he's getting into too much trouble, but I might check every so often.
Not a
If I
bad
hear
idea.
silence, I'll check.
If you hear silence, he's probably plotting something. That's
what I've found. That's generally been my impression.
Um, what were we talking about actually a moment ago?
We were talking about sort of angering the religious.
Angering the religious, which is something I think you do when they pay attention to you. They pay more attention to me because early on in my writing career, they mistook me for an apologist for the sort of things many of them believe, whereas in fact, I'm every bit as hostile to lots of mere Christianity as I am to unthinking atheist polemics or anything else of that kind. And for reasons you yourself have adduced, they mistook me for a political conservative rather than someone who's just a reactionary in the general sense that I'll make fun of anything given the chance. And I used to. Although you have to be more careful about that now because jokes I made in the past I couldn't make now because I realize what kind of people can take you seriously. You have to be very careful. But yeah, angering the religious. And one way to do it is actually just to cite orthodoxies they're unaware of.
I had this idea for an essay I thought that would be interesting. I don't know if I really have the expertise to do it per se, but the ways in which so much of normative Christian belief in the United States, in particular, has some sort of variation of an ancient heresy, right? But people take it as being doctrinaire or what have you. So I feel like we have like a lot of Donatists in the United States sometimes. I feel like We have very few genuine Trinitarians in the United States. There's a lot of people who
Well,
veer
there are a
one
lot of
way.
tritheists. There, you know.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And I think that, and they don't even know they're tritheists, though. I think is what's so interesting is it speaks to kind of the general, maybe poor catechization of folks or something. But there's a lot of like fervently held beliefs, but the definition of those beliefs is sometimes a little bit ambiguous, I think.
Well, I'll tell you this. I mean, I used to assume that the ones who knew the least about the tradition and who would be the most belligerent in defending their little, the sectarian corner of the tradition would be certain kinds of hardcore Calvinists or persons who were various parts of the Free Church and you just weren't aware of the tradition at all. Actually, in my experience in recent years, it's always been the Thomists because they're the ones. I mean, by Thomists, I mean those who hold to the school. I don't mean,
Sure.
you know, this 16th century school and after. Is that because they've got a system that they have equated with the faith and the Catholic faith, they are profoundly, I mean, as a class, as a race, as a people, profoundly ignorant of the tradition at large. And yeah, go on.
Sorry.
No,
No,
no.
I agree with you. I think it's always fascinating to me how I'm from Pittsburgh originally. Well, and I live in Pittsburgh again. I've moved back here, and that's always the sort of joke about Pittsburgh is that God said to John Knox that he would give him Scotland and he'd throw in Pittsburgh for free. So we're sort of a city that has like this sort of low church Calvinist kind of origin, but there's not a lot of Calvinists here now for the most part. It's a very Catholic city, by comparison to what it was 200 some years ago. So I have to confess that I've only really encountered, I think, people who would describe themselves as Calvinists, as like tulip Calvinists, very rarely in my life. But from the sort of online discourse that I've encountered, I agree with you, I think, in terms of their maybe historical amnesia when it comes to how their own tradition fits into the larger kind of Christian story in history. There's that sense in which, Christianity somehow seems to begin in like 16th century Geneva instead of first century Judea. And I always
but by the same token, the Thomists, I mean, those of the second scholasticism, which is currently in revival, especially in America. For them, it starts in the 16th century too. I mean, they're clinging their idea of the ancient tradition of the church is Baroque Catholicism, and specifically an understanding of grace and nature, which simply is anachronistic when trying to read the fathers or the scripture or whatever. And yet they're the most censorious. I have been attacked for saying things about the exegesis of the Old Testament that are just like straightforward quotations from Gregory of Nyssa and Maximus and Augustine, but even of a certain famous Catholic thinker of the 20th century, Joseph Ratzinger. But they don't fit the Thomist paradigm. I get attacked for it. I wrote a book called You Are Gods, which really is meant to be provocative in many ways, but at the end of the day, just comes down to Maximus the Confessor, the Pseudo Dionysius, things like that. Again, attacked because it's outside the Thomistic mainstream, and they're just literally unaware of the rest of the tradition. And it does, in a sense, balance out my view of things. For years, I used to fulminate against, say, the new atheists for not ever knowing what they were talking about, for always creating in their mind what they assumed people who believed in God were talking about. And I realize now that they're not only are they not unique in this regard, they're not even particularly adventurous in their bigotries. How's it going, Guy?
Hey, Finn, he agrees with you on that, I think. I was curious, I mean, do you find that a lot of the sort of Thomas stuff comes from the so-called kind of trad caths, if you're familiar with the term?
Yeah.
That's like the main origin.
Yeah.
It's like a cultural group.
That's the tradition they love, is the 16th century tradition with this god-awful, metaphysically confused theology of grace and nature, that itself was an historical accident trying to get around certain presumed condemnations of ancillary issues. Yeah, that's it. I mean, and with it comes a kind of infatuation with the politics of that period, a notion of the absolutist state and of a sort of throne and altar accommodation. But we're already off track. We began this conversation and we're already off track.
I know. It's the nature of the discourse.
It's also, I like whining about people who are mean to me.
I'm exactly the same way. I have it is something I have great tolerance for, is to kind of whine about things, especially online imbecility. I mean, I sort of I'm fascinated by the trad caths as a category of people, as somebody who's kind of a very nominal cradle Catholic, but culturally, I think, very Catholic. I'm always fascinated by the kind of adoption of this sort of tridentine Catholic identity that merges with this kind of like terrible Republican politics, and the kind of subculture that has emerged out of it, that's very online and very modern, of course, even if it pretends not to be. It can't help but be a beast of modernity.
It's quintessentially modern. It is the modern form. That in fact, it is modernity recapitulated from its most catastrophic moment, precisely the thing that led to the secularization of culture and the collapse of what they understand to be Christendom.
Absolutely. No, I completely. It's the sort of folks can't help but be the monster that they want to defeat sometimes, I think. And there's such, and then in more superficial kind of ways too, just in terms of faddishness and being so terminally kind of engaged with a particular type of meme politics, and all of that. It's a fascinating and kind of grotesque group to me. But I also, it annoys me how I hate the term mainstream media, but I'll use it for lack of a better phrase. A largely secular media will focus on them as if they are somehow representative of broader currents of faith. So you'll have, the newspaper of record will go on and interview a number of kind of trad cath figures, and it completely ignores the fact that you're talking about a religion of over 1 billion people, largely focused in the global South. People are largely not white who are Catholic or Christian more broadly. And yet like a half dozen kind of very tweety kind of young people are positioned as the voice of like authentic Christianity.
They're the most sinister ones of all. The ones who are getting long in the tooth. It's like Adrian Vermeule. You just think, well, he's always been a bit weird, and his conversion to Catholicism was unburdened by any sense, obviously, that he should convert at the same time to Christianity. I mean, it is the young tweety ones, especially the ones who are clean shaven. I find them especially sinister.
You got to keep the beard. As a fan of beards such as yourself and myself, I respect the beard.
Needs a little liberty. You insist on clipping it. I want to point out that.
Normally my wife makes me clip it, actually, sometimes, but when I do try to get some heft to it, it just kind of goes out, is the problem.
But give it a chance. See if she'll just grant you a year's release to see how far, because at the end of a year, she might actually find it has a kind of Melvillian grandeur to it or something. Now, it could be shapeless like Tolstoy's, in which case you have to
I get fuzzy, I think, more than like a kind of like Old Testament heft, really. But
yeah, it's a problem. Yeah. Well, anyway, so we having started with an excursus of some considerable length, let's talk about style then, since we've both you in the recent when did Minding the Ghost come out? 1.5 years ago?
You had the Arts and Letters Daily, I think, just reran your piece from The Lamp on style.
That's right. Which is also on my Substack page in 2 parts.
Okay.
Yeah, they did actually, and but it is interesting because we do. I suppose it's obvious. I mean, certain things are obvious. You go looking for an example of the high point of early modern English prose at its most grandiose. Obviously, you're going to point to Sir Thomas Browne. It just sooner or later it would be something of an oversight, And obviously, if you're going to complain about these sort of apostolic letters from above explaining to us how we should write in the simplest possible manner, then of course Orwell's Politics in the English Language and Strunk and White are the two obvious texts. So it's not strange that we both touch upon those. There is obviously though, there are other places where we're in a deeper agreement, one that seems not as obvious, such as, I don't know, attributing the cult of unadorned simplicity and form over function to the economism of late capitalist culture. How long was it brewing in your mind to write that essay? Because I've been thinking of writing on this issue about 30 years. So
that's a great question. So I have two answers to that. I think that one is the shorter answer is the immediate incident that occasioned my writing Punic Encomium, that particular essay. And then I have kind of a more general answer as to I think the various disparate threads that were going in my head for a couple of years in terms of influencing me with that writing. So one of the things that I do that you probably should never do, but I won't stop, is I read the comments on the internet, which is never a good idea. And I can't help myself. I think it's like tonguing a canker sore or something. I need to know what's being said. And I've gotten better about it since I've gotten off of Twitter, but it's still something that I do. And I had written an essay that was about bibliomancy for Befroy. And this was back in 2017, I think. And it was an essay that I had a tremendous time writing. I loved putting it together. I enjoyed doing it. And I always feel like part of writing, if you don't enjoy writing, then you shouldn't do it. It's kind of one of the, unless you have to for financial reasons, maybe. But, there's that old Orwell quote.
Well, what kind of job would that be? I mean,
emails, just writing emails. I had there's that Orwell quote where he says, writing a book is horrible and no one would do it if they could help it. And I always think, well, then why did he write books? Why do it?
That has never been my experience at all. There are things I don't want to write because it's, this is, do I have to go over this for the 40th time? So within the realm of debate and dispute on I can say that becomes tedious, but the actual act of writing I find rather blissful, to be honest.
I completely agree with you. I mean, I think it's something that it makes thought capable for me. I think in a lot of ways, sometimes I don't know what I think about something till I go through the process of writing. And I enjoy lush Baroque prose to read it, but to write it as well. I mean, I take a joy in putting together Byzantine sentences that work out in a way, right? And so I really enjoyed writing this particular essay, and it wasn't I didn't make a lot of money off of it. It wasn't something that I did because I had to do it.
Well, it's a manifesto, and Marx and Engels didn't make any money off the Communist Manifesto either. I don't think so.
Just from Fred's dad, I suppose.
That's right.
So I wrote this piece on bibliomancy, and one of the comments basically denounced my purple prose. And it was like a sling for a second. I was like, this is one of the things with writing online too, is I always figure how much of the criticism do I need to listen to and how much of it's just like a guy in the internet. Do you know what I mean? And I worry that I don't take criticism seriously because of the proverbial guy on the internet. So I thought about this purple prose thing and why it bothered me so much, because I know that I don't necessarily write in a way that the mavens of style that have reigned ascendant for 50, 60 years say that you should write. I'm not a journalism school writer. I'm definitely not a partisan of Strunk and White. And so over the course of a couple of months, I think Punic Encomium was kind of my individual response to this anonymous person. It was my way of kind of saying why I thought that criticism was a dumb one, basically. But then in the longer sense, it's something that I've been thinking about, having gone through graduate school in English, but then also having taught freshman composition for 16 years now. I've taught freshman composition, and so on the one hand, I have the kind of commentary that I would sometimes get from advisors or professors about the need to simplify my prose, which is rarely stated in an English grad program, obviously, where jargon is loved.
Yeah.
But sometimes the labyrinthine sentence less so, depending. And then also having had to teach things, or having chosen to teach things like Orwell's Politics in the English Language, and asking myself what it necessarily did for my students, where it might be beneficial, but where it might also be a problem. So that's something that's been kind of in the back of my head as a way to kind of answer some of the critiques that I had received over the years, going back 15, 20 years.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you wrote it. Again, I deplore the sorcery you employed to steal ideas from me before I'd ever committed them to paper.
Just through scrying mirrors and
scrying, sortilege. Almost certainly there was some haruspication in there, I think.
I just grabbed a copy of the Aeneid and let it flip open and did that a few times.
Yeah. With a pin, I hope,
Exactly. Well, yeah, you have to do it with a pin.
And dipped in the blood of an innocent child or something. Oh, no.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But
not this child, though. So.
Of course not. What a brute. I mean, just a child had accidentally cut his finger. I don't mean that.
Yes, exactly.
But yeah, no. Well, you see, the curious. I mean, obviously, we acknowledge that balance is important. I mean, you go over more than this, and you begin producing something that's genuinely unpleasant. It's like trying to live entirely on gorgonzola and dark chocolate. I mean, you need something with a lighter.
Yeah, some greens in there.
But I mean, this has always been the case. I mean, throughout the history, this is true of any prose. I mean, but in English prose, in long retrospect, the writers we most admire are those who knew how to achieve exquisitely unexpected harmonies between the ornate and complex on one hand, and the plangently plain, or in the terms of the used to apply, the beautiful and the sublime, in the sense that in classical theory these words apply. And I mean, I understand. I have friends in the academic world who give Strunk and White to undergraduates because their undergraduates are barely literate as writers, and so simplifying seems to be the only way. I mean, the way to get them to write declarative sentences that actually have a sort of, if nothing else, subject, verb, predicate structure or something. It seems like a useful thing to give them. I think, though, that the problem with it is that it's a book that many embrace as a guide to writing good English, as opposed to writing minimal English, and of course, as I point out in my essay, it's also written by two men who, for all of their talent, well, E.B. White's talent. I mean, obviously, E.B. White was a wonderful writer. I think he misunderstood his own gifts. If you look at his prose, it's not nearly as simple as he seems to think it was, but it is very clear. I mean, but it's not. It's full of very sort of complex cadences and delays, and so it in a sense, I think he convinced himself he was doing something that when he was actually writing, he wasn't doing.
I think that's true,
but
I'm sorry.
All I would say is it's just shocking how little they actually knew about the technical aspects of writing. The book is Strunk was supposedly a teacher of English composition. It's full of errors about basic grammar. About basic syntax.
Cornell? Am I right in that?
Yeah. I mean, as I think it's famously, I mentioned it in my essay, and then I found there was someone else who'd already pointed this out. When it advises the use of the active rather than passive constructions, which is one of those sort of meaningless pieces of advice that journalists believe in, but not writers. The examples they give it 4 examples of passive constructions. The problem is only one of them is actually a passive construction. The others are all various forms of active construction, just in different tenses, and it's shocking, how. So I think Strunk and White is like a tumor, to be honest.
I couldn't agree more with you on it, and I feel like it's a book where all that is like interesting about rhetoric goes to die sometimes, right? They just dispense with like 2,500 years of the rhetorical conceits that give music to prose. And I think the thing that is most galling to me, and I think you're right. I think for first year college students who need it to just be able to kind of drive down the street one block and park, as it were, it's fine. But it's taken as a given. It's just quoted by editors and by teachers. Read Strunk and White, read Strunk and White, read Strunk and White, as if it's this kind of like Bible. And I always said the Bible's not even the Bible. Like I don't know why the elements of style has to be this like unfailing, infallible guide.
If you were really a writer of any ambition, who felt he or she had to follow its advice, so that you would never become a writer of any quality. It is a way of thwarting every interesting creative impulse you might have. Now, it might dissuade you from certain errors of taste, because when you're young, when you're learning to write, you go too far. You make mistakes.
I think that's the thing, is whenever I hear the like read Strunk and White, I always, and maybe this is uncharitable, but I always think, well, this is somebody not to take seriously on writing right now. No, it's just
From that point on, that person is simply sort of a cashiered authority for me. Someone has said that.
I'm with you on that. I mean, it's probably slightly better than if somebody says, "Have you ever read Ayn Rand?" But like, not by much. Or it's maybe better than like Dianetics or something. But it's just there's rarely an explanation of why it's supposed to be.
The other thing is its pronouncements are peremptory, and they emanate from nowhere, except weird. For instance, William Strunk insists that you should always prefer the word forcible to forceful. This is in the early, why? Why? I mean, forceful means full of force.
It goes back to what you said. Some of it, and not in that particular example, but when you're talking about the kind of fetishizing of active voice and things, I think it comes out of that journalistic imperative, which was so materially defined, right? I mean, you had to have an economy of words because you were limited by the literal size of a paper, right? Sure. Which is like.
And I've written columns for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, things like that, and New York Times. A bit more fun to write for, but the Wall Street Journal has more money to pay. That
sounds right.
But the funny thing is, you can learn. I mean, economy does not have to be poverty. I mean, that's the thing. I'm a great believer in Japanese aesthetics, in which you can achieve the most opulent effects through knowing the difference between the restrained and the minimalist, knowing when to press for a greater effect and when not to, and you can write with a certain sumptuousness, a certain beauty and grace within the confines you're given, if because it's not excess for its own sake. It's just knowing. Some of back when I used to write for a journal whose name I now never utter.
I can guess what it is.
Can you? I thought I was being very mysterious and discreet. But for the last few years I was there, they had devised this thing for me called The Last Page, which was 1,550 words. Basically, I had to stay within to fit it within the format, the physical format of the journal. But you can do it.
I will let you know that nap time is approaching, so we will have a respite hopefully soon. But anyhow, I'm sorry.
I can pause at some point if you like, but that's all right. I don't mind the sound. I miss the sound of a small child around that.
Okay.
Curious to say, it's not everyone listening to this recording may agree, but remember, I can sort of lower the volume at your end so that.
Okay.
So that right, so that it means the editing process is a little longer, but I'm willing to do it because.
Do you mind if we just pause for a second?
Oh yeah. So how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm relatively good.
All right, so back to what we were talking. Well, we don't need to spend the entire time abusing Strunk and White, though it's always fun to do that, because of the disproportionate influence it's wielded over tender and manipulable minds over the years. But we also, of course, both of us had our run-ins with George Orwell. Now, the funny thing is there, of course, no one denies the healthy counsel against jargon. I mean, the degree to which Orwell was trying to lay down rules for avoiding the kind of obfuscations that allowed the political class and to evade answering real questions about policies and the like. Yeah. But that's not actually the essay he wrote. That was the occasion.
Yeah, and politics in the English language is an interesting case. I've taught that. I used to begin every semester that I taught freshman composition with politics in the English language. And I think that philosophically he makes some fascinating points that are then reflected in his novels about the ways in which thought is created by language, and I think that's very true. I think some of his conclusions, I think you're right that something about the way that jargon can serve to kind of obscure the reality of things is very well taken. But then some of his conclusions about, and you mentioned this in your essay, the need to eliminate any foreign word as it occurs in English is bizarre. And I mean, I think it reflects. There's a lot that you can say that's good about Orwell. There's a lot you can say that's not good about Orwell. And he certainly had some very particular English prejudices, I will say. And I think that bit of advice has much more to do with his own kind of background and biases than it does with composition.
Yeah, good socialist though he was, there is a bit of, Colonel Blimp in that kind of...
He's a very Little Britain kind of guy sometimes.
That's also part. I mean, that's part of the left as well. There was a kind of Little Britain brigade on the left as well. I mean, and that's of course not uncommon even today. So, but it is strange. I mean, he did have that kind of bulldogish suspicion of things that were too fancy and foreign, which is curious. Is especially curious given not only the history of English, but its practice over the centuries. I mean, there's never been a language more gleefully voracious when it comes to other languages. It's always looking, part of this was its imperial past, but part of it is just that it was always a heterogeneous tongue. That's its history. It was always a mixture of the Germanic and Latin, Latinical, at least after the 11th century, and that it was the language spoken by an empire that girdled the globe. We're not praising, but we're recognizing that as a result, it absorbed all sorts of words from around the world and did so with considerable relish. That's just what English is. it's not a pure tongue. Purity is the one thing it never possessed and never aspired to.
And it's never had a national academy in the manner that the French have, right? There've been attempts, certainly, like, in the 16th century, when people like Dryden and others wanted to make the language more
French,
more Latinate than it already was. Yeah, exactly. But I'm saying English never had,
but mostly by creating rules that were fake rules.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which we still labor under sometimes. Anytime anyone says never end a sentence in a preposition, I always think about these kind of very prescriptivist dictates that were handed down 350 years ago.
Even when you're told that however must always be a post-positive, that's simply because in Latin, autem is always a post-positive. It has nothing to do with the actual English word or its history of usage or even exactly what it means, because it doesn't have exactly the same range of uses as the Latin autem. So, I mean, this is, but when it came to vocabulary, it's true. I mean, the French Academy over the years, it's gone through periods of austerity and periods of licentiousness, I guess. But on the whole, the point of the Academy is to make the dictionary as small as possible. In a sense, make sure that what's in it is actually, it may grudgingly allow these strange mongrel words like beefsteak for taken from beef steak. It's not even really the English word. In order because it takes longer because French doesn't use composite forms for nouns, the way the Germanic tongues do. But in the English speaking world, it was exactly the opposite. The Oxford English Dictionary was this sort of endless quest to make sure that nothing was left out, that every odd variant,
promiscuous kind of,
every local variant arising from a forgotten Middle English word was included, as well as staying up to date with all and Orwell, I mean, is a good example of someone whose instincts cut in the opposite directions. I mean, he complains about the use of the word instantaneous, which in his day sounded a little bit pretentious. Well, now we can't imagine anyone thinking that that's a jargon word. And it's,
I think that always strikes me with this sort of composition guides too, especially the kind of, I call them like priests of parsimony, right? The kind of Strunk and White and Orwell and whoever else, it sometimes strikes me that they don't seem to like language very much. Yeah. Like there's like an almost Puritan's lack of joy at language. I might have to check on my son again. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'll be right back.
No, I mean, I'm enjoying the somewhat staccato nature of our recording today. It's different.
I will say, just if you're still recording, it's worth putting in. Maybe, or you can decide on it. But I was teaching. When I do teaching, it's always been online since he's been born. And I was like lecturing, and he just sort of like will drone on in imitation of me as I'm talking to my students. And if I try to speak louder, he will match me in volume. So he's kind of like he's like my most potent critic, I think.
I'll tell you though, sometimes it might get wearying, but I can't tell you how much you'll miss it when it stops.
I do believe that.
It's odd. The things that you would think would drive, even if they drive you up the wall in the moment, they become heart-rendingly moving when remembered over any space of time.
I'm very fortunate too in that I get to work from home, so like I get to be with him a whole lot, and you have kids, so you know what it's like, and I'm relatively new and inexperienced to this, but it's I've heard what you've said before, and I believe it, and I try to keep it in mind at these moments.
Cling to it as a precious hope, like the believers hope in the kingdom of God. All right, I'm going to pause and let you see to your paternal responsibilities for a moment. but I think
Okay.
it's kind of funny myself.
Okay.
There's part of me that's rather enjoying the absurdity. But anyway, we can move on from this topic, though. I'll
Sure.
just say that one thing, I mean, we also have to remember we are living at a moment that you could, if you're an alarmist, and I am, say is a catastrophic moment for literacy in general. I mean, I think that at least I've stopped teaching undergraduates for the moment. Okay, I don't have had undergraduate students for a few years, but I did see, I mean, a constant and an alarmingly obvious decline in attention spans, the ability to read, the ability to write at any length. I mean, when I was an undergraduate, when you took a 3-hour exam and you filled 4 blue books, you can give that 3. Yeah.
Oh, no. I was going to say that I think I agree with you on that. And a lot of it except for graduate school, I've worked as a contingent faculty the whole time. And one of the things that I've noticed as an adjunct, it's just the way in which a certain bottom line financial kind of corporatization of higher ed, I think, has in part contributed. I mean, it's not the only reason for why there has been kind of a diminishment, I think, in some students' willingness to engage with the class. But I do think it like contributes to a kind of idea that everything is about getting a good grade, because getting a good grade is obviously important, or at least they think it's important in terms of getting a job and so
But
on and so forth, which is understandable. But
I mean, I understand that, and of course, more and more people in the university try to justify the very existence of the humanities as somehow equipping people with skills that will help them to succeed in life, which to me is obviously not the point of the humanities. The point of the humanities is to equip people with humanity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, it's always the kind of justifications, the instrumental justifications for the humanities at best can seem kind of desperate, like an attempt on the part of beleaguered humanities professors.
They're saying it in order to keep the departments open. Yeah. I mean, I remember there were, this was the University of Virginia a few years ago. I wasn't on staff then. I just happened to be living on a mountaintop outside Charlottesville. I'd gotten my doctorate and taught there in previous years, but this was during an interregnum, whatever. There were debates with the board. I think there were members of the board from the sort of commercial side of life who were all for financing a larger business school and all that, and pouring money into the STEM disciplines, who were advocating the elimination of, now get this, these are the 2 departments they thought might be eliminated as superfluous: classics and German. I mean, I mean,
classics always gets it first too, don't they? I feel like whenever
could they choose 2 departments that the absence of which would be a greater blow to any notion of humane education? Yeah, I mean, sure, the French department would be the other one, and then English, I guess, in general. But I mean, it's like, German, Latin, Greek. What of any importance has ever been written in those languages? It's it was extraordinary. But I mean more actually. Not the sort of the economic imperatives that more and more are used to justify the insanely exorbitant tuitions that universities charge in this country, and that are sort of the whole laissez-faire culture of American life. But I mean, actually, the effects, social, cognitive, neurological, even, of social media and living in the internet, instant, fragmentary conversation being the more and more the normal. I mean, Twitter is a perfect example of paring discourse down to digestible or indigestible nuggets, right? And and teaching people to think in a disjunctive way and to speak in fragments of ideas. And of course, then to be carried away by some algorithm that's trying to get you to link into some other series of conversations and some other, in the hope that there'll be more use time, and then they're trying to sell you things in the same way. I just think that these objects, for instance, I have one, are actually a cataclysm, culturally speaking. And I know we'll be told, well, in every generation, people say that the new technology, yeah, but what if this time it's right? I mean, and who's to say it wasn't right in the past? I'm sure that, the people who complained about television were right. It did cretinize us to some degree, to be honest. I mean, and this, I think, is just what we've created now is a culture of carefully cultivated stupidity and mental ductility or mental malleability.
I think the amazing thing with the internet, and particularly the smartphone, which in some sense turned us all into cyborgs, right? Because we're all connected to the internet all the time anyhow, in a way that even 10 years ago, you had to physically sit down in front of your computer to go onto Facebook or whatever. But now it's standing in line at the grocery store, sitting on a subway, or stuck in traffic or whatever.
God forbid that you actually have a conversation with the guy next to you.
Or just do nothing, right? Just the blissfulness of just being quiet by yourself is a lost art. And I think what's so amazing and remarkable is we've seen that change, and I've seen it in myself in a very quick period of time. I mean, it's like a couple years. And cognitively, I feel, for a very long time, I had just a flip phone, and I resisted the smartphone because I knew, and I know my own personality, that I would get addicted to it. And I was right. I feel like a disturbing lack or absence if I leave my phone behind. And I know it's bad. I know that's not good. I know it's done things to my concentration. It's done things, I think, to my ability to think in some sense. And then you're right. It's just sort of the tyranny of the algorithm, which is used basically to kind of keep everyone in a heightened dopamine state of being, outraged or whatever, so that they're kind of continually clicking. And it's on the one hand, I think it's very interesting to me to know that I can see a time that was not that long ago from us, just a couple years, where things were not necessarily like that, and to see how rapidly it's able to kind of hijack one's consciousness to an extent. But then I do wonder about people who've only been in that world. What kind of?
Well, that's the thing. Is many of the undergraduates that I saw in those last years when I will admit I have not had any regular contact with undergraduates since 2015. So, I mean, whatever teaching I did in that other period was with graduate students. And even before that, I had the good luck in several programs to be more or less exclusively dealing with the honors program, So I was sort of kept at a distance from the worst effects. But I have seen examples enough to know that those who are now coming of age entirely in this world in which we all flow together into the same virtual space, but have no idea where the landmarks are, I think has done, maybe in some cases, irreparable cognitive damage. I think, I don't, perhaps human beings have always been as credulous as we've discovered they are in recent years. That the internet plays, it's obvious from all the political movements of our time, especially on the moronic right, but also on the left as well. Just there at the moment, the greatest specter of doom hanging over the world happens to be coming from the right, so we can be especially worried about that. Is that perhaps our minds have always been that subject to manipulation, but we didn't have a medium for it that was anywhere near as insidiously effective as the one that we all now take for granted. And I actually think that in some cases, these kids, in order to learn to read, and I honestly believe if you can't read, you probably can't think, because it's really much the same process going on. In order to read or write, there would actually have to be forcibly separated from that and go through a long period of almost forced re-education, see if there's just enough neural plasticity left there or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I've always found that, and one of the things, with Twitter, which I've now been blissfully free of for about 2 months, and has had a remarkable improvement, I think, in my ability to think. At least I hope so. And I left in part because of the chief twit or whatever he calls himself that took over the site, but really he was more of an excuse for something that I needed to do for myself anyhow. And one of the things with Twitter that I found, because I was on it all the time, and I would post a lot, but more than anything, I would just, as kind of a tick, I would just check Twitter. And I noticed that because, Twitter's composed for the most part of words, and it kind of gives you an illusion of textuality, but it's kind of to actual reading what like candy corn is to actual food, right?
Yeah.
And I found that you're looking at the same 140
By the way,
characters.
You've chosen a particularly apt metaphor there, because I'm one of those people who from early age thought candy corn was the single most revolting flavor.
It's grotesque. And addictive, weirdly, for how bad it is.
Well, not for me. I tasted it as a child, felt that I'd become violently ill, and even the fragrance of it makes me feel so. Luckily, but anyway, yes, go on. We don't need to know about my gut.
Like Twitter, like it kind of fills your stomach with just these empty calories, but because of and I don't know if it's the nature of the form that the tweets themselves are so short, or it's there's just a certain way in which the medium, I think, encourages imbecility and a kind of weird uniformity of thought. And it happens in an almost more mysterious way than I think even the most obvious sense of like people see opinions that they parrot, right? It kind of makes you think, have the same thoughts almost as other people, as opposed to just agreeing with other people, which might be bad enough. And I find that there's a rhetorical type of tick that exists on Twitter. People will say stuff like, I don't know who needs to hear this, but, incoming threat or whatever, like certain turns of phrase or certain ways of saying things that you see repeated over and over again. And it's like a virus or something that hijacks.
Well, I'm glad you freed yourself. I, on 2 occasions for a short period, had a Twitter account. The first time was just to see what it was like. I had it open for a month because I'd been complaining about social media. I actually didn't have any experience with social media. I don't have a Facebook page, never have. There is a Facebook page.
There's a fan page for you, though, on Facebook, I know.
There is a fan page, yeah, but I've never been on it. You actually have to join it, and you have to have a Facebook account. And so, it's a good, luckily, because, of course, we're all egotists, so I'm sure I'd be enough. I'd go and check occasionally and see if I wanted to throw in a comment. I'm glad I can't do that. But with Twitter, twice I had an account. One was just to see what it was like, and then I closed it down. And the other was for a period I was using it to communicate with a very ill friend. That was the only way messages, he was keeping us aware of his illness, and we were sending him messages. And we're using Twitter because he didn't feel up to writing individual emails. And then I closed that account down after a while, once once it had ceased to be necessary. I did not like the experience. This is the odd thing. I found it distasteful. I found it unpleasant. I found it galling, and I couldn't turn away. Mm-hmm. I found myself, for some reason, replying to people out of the blue just because sometimes it was because I could come up with a good joke and I just couldn't resist it. And I thought, yeah. But then they asked me something or complained of something I said, and I said, well, and then I would feel I had to correct them. I mean, why do I have to correct Mary Houston of 472 Bluebird Way in San Diego. I've never met her, never will meet her, and she's not exactly, someone I have the time to deal with directly. But, I can see how you get drawn into that world because it creates a false intimacy that's actually just total public exposure, which is the joke of it. But, when I think about the damage done to the capacity to that, I mean, look, one year, do you remember when, let me give you an example. I think it was 1979, maybe, that Christopher Lash's The Culture of Narcissism was a bestseller.
I've never read the book. I know I was actually reading up on. I was like wiki diving on him a few weeks ago.
Well, to be honest, it's not the book itself I'm thinking about. I wasn't about to make a point about narcissism. The point is that at the time the book sold, no one was complaining that it was hard to follow because it was the sort of prose you expected from a book that required readers who'd grown up reading books. Those books might have been Robert Louis Stevenson, or they might have been Jack Kerouac, or they might have been, Kant and Hegel. But nonetheless, no one thought it was extravagantly difficult to read. But I know that now, I've published books that are pitched at the same readership, and I get, some people love them, but I get indignant emails from people who find, complain about, why did you use this word? And the words, I don't mean words of great technical obscurity or even the sometimes playfully esoteric words I use, expecting people to go look them up because they're getting the joke. I mean, why did you use the term legerdemain? So why didn't you say cleverness? And I had to say, well, it doesn't mean cleverness for one thing. It means prestidigitation. I should have said that, whatever the case. But the point is, more and more of this is that there's a stratification. I have my readers of those books. They sell well. I communicate to those who are wanting to read them, but more and more you see people who find texts that really shouldn't be hard to follow if you grew up reading books rather than tweets.
I know that I had...
It's a completely different, or something they can't enter into at all. They don't understand metaphors. They don't understand how a subordinate clause works. They don't, they can't follow one line of thought. If you...
You're talking about
God
vocabulary.
Forbid, excursus or an excursus or excursus in the plural. That's an insurmountable obstacle. And you feel, one way I want to say to them, go to hell. I didn't write for you then. Who are you to try to correct the way I write you? But the other one I think is like, oh my God, you've been robbed of something and you don't know it. Something.
I'm with you when it comes to vocabulary, and you mentioned getting emails from people complaining about the words you might choose to use. I'm always shocked by the sheer laziness of somebody who's willing to find your email address and contact
write an email,
but not look up the word.
A bloody dictionary. Yeah? I mean,
I had a. This is something again with never read the comments. I was on a certain website in which people post their book reviews, and I won't say its name because I don't want to bring its sort of evil demonic gods upon us. But I wrote a book a couple years ago that's it's a very short history of my hometown of Pittsburgh. It's a little impressionistic and it's a little bit lyrical, but it is by no means a technical book at all. It's for the general reader. And several of the commentators were like, I didn't know what these words meant sometimes or whatever. And I thought, we literally carry supercomputers in our pockets connected to all of human knowledge. You could just look the word up and then you'd know a new word, And it's, I don't know what.
That used to be part of the joy of reading, right? I mean, it
exactly.
was discovery. You were learning new ideas, new words, it was, well, recently I did a little thing on the Webster's second edition comprehensive dictionary, the 1944 edition, which Nabokov loved so much. It was actually, from which he, from which he got his. In fact, it'll show. I have more to say on it that'll be showing up on Substack shortly. But in Pale Fire, of course, there's the famous use of the word lemniscate to great effect, because, of course, he uses it in the poem that John Shade has written to describe a figure eight left in the sand on the beach by a bicycler. And then you have the joke of Charles Kinbote making having absolutely no idea why he would use this word, but quoting the bit from the Webster's. That's the dictionary he has. And it's hilarious. It's a great moment. Now, that's actually, I think I read Pale Fire for the first time I was 16, and that's why I got hooked on Nabokov, because at 16 it was very, very heady stuff, and I was already a very bookish kid, and this just fit right into my world of sensibility beautifully, my sense of humor and my sense of language. But that's where I learned the word lemniscate. And, I can't say that I've had many occasions to use it in conversation ever since. But, I remember that word from that book at that moment. And, that's what the life of reading has been. And, Nabokov himself, always have a dictionary when you read, because no interesting writer has a small vocabulary. Goethe said it is a wretched writer with whom a lexicon can keep pace. And of course, he wrote it in the days when a lexicon was still a fairly exotic idea. But
yeah.
So let's move on to something else.
Oh, sure.
So, because we've been dwelling on this now. Luckily, there will be intervals of silence where you've gone off. And I'll cut those out. And that will actually prove that we've only been talking for 14 seconds.
I know. It's just been like a minute.
Yeah, we think it's. But religion and the religious impulse and religion and trying to understand what's going on in the arts and in literature in particular is something of a theme in your work. You say you describe yourself as nominally Catholic, vestigially Catholic. I don't know how you put yourself. I think of you as liminally something.
I like that.
Yeah. I mean,
liminally something.
I would never accuse you of being a materialist rationalist.
No,
not religiously dogmatic. You clearly have a sense of the numinous and of the spiritual. And at the same time, you've got plenty of room for doubt. But when you write about literature, recurrently in your writings, there's a fascination, it seems to me, with the way in which great literature is either obsessed with or incapable of not addressing the transcendent, the mysterious, not in the sense of just the unknown, but I was George Steiner's book Real Presences, which is a wonderful example of how Steiner could be brilliant on one page and insufferable on the next, back and forth.
Which I've heard about him as a person too. So.
Well, I never actually spoke to. I used to see him because he was still there when I was at Cambridge as a grad student, as a postgrad student, as they'd say in Britain. And you'd occasionally see him walking along, talking to D.M. McKinnon. The two at times seemed inseparable. I never got a chance to talk to him, but yeah, I mean, that was his reputation, was that he could be both delightful and insufferable. Sort of like Harold Bloom in a different modality. I have to tell you my Harold Bloom story before we part today. But
I collect Harold Bloom stories. I've got like my 6 degrees.
Okay, well, remind me of that.
Sure. Because
I think it may very well be the case that the last person to whom he ever wrote an email before he died was me. Just by chance, we had an exchange, and he was on, and he said, "I'm not feeling well though, so we'll have to talk about this later." And then the next morning, I discovered he'd passed away. Oh. And I'll tell you that story because it's interesting. But sticking with you and your weird obsessions,
sure,
and your twisted and or other side, let's say, your Brook of Jabbok sort of wrestling with the angel of God sort of approach to things. I mean, is that? I mean, I have to ask. I mean, how do you construe that relation? I mean, how do you understand? I mean, I've thought it's fascinating to me. Something John Updike once said is that even unbelieving writers, serious writers, cannot stop probing the absence of their belief the way you might, with your tongue probe a place where a recently removed tooth. That,
I think that, it's funny when you reviewed Pandemonium, my devil book, and you sort of described my approach to religion in a manner very similar to as you just described it right now. I kind of gleefully read that to my wife, and she said, "Boy, he's got your number." So I think that I think it's a really apt summation of my own sometimes confused relationship to the nature of the transcendent and the numinous, but my I think obsession is a correct word for it. And I always find that the one thing that is always the most frustrating to me is when I'm misread as an atheist. And when you said I do not come across as like a materialist,
no,
I'm glad that I don't.
Yeah.
And I've had people who've contacted like, oh, it's nice that there's an atheist writer that takes religion seriously. I'm like, I've never said that I'm an atheist. Nothing that I cop to being a cracked, unconventional believer, maybe a heretic, but I'm certainly not an atheist in the new atheist sense of the word, which I disdain.
Well, you'd have to have part of your frontal lobe removed in order.
I feel like 15 years after the Dawkins book, it's almost not even fair to beat up on the new atheists anymore.
No. I mean, and to be honest, at the time, it seemed like it was an important, but they lost the public argument so badly. I mean, just through
they gravitated towards the alt-right in some ways.
Oh yeah, well, Sam, what's his name? Who's the
really Sam Harris, the
really twerpish one? Yeah, it turns out to be racist and right way. Yeah, just as you would expect, given certain things. People were willing to tolerate his anti-Muslim bigotry at the time because there was all the terror of the sort of Al-Qaeda.
Sure.
It was soon after the attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. And so people sort of gave him a pass on what was pretty bigoted rhetoric by any stretch of the imagination, and even the advocacy of measures that were obviously, despotic, even terroristic. I don't know how he got away with it at the time, but he did. We're all a bit shell-shocked, perhaps, by events and word. But now, of course, yes, it turns out that he's just another sordid little fascist,
twerpy little authoritarian.
Yeah, and a particularly unimpressive one too, because he has that kind of that reptilian quality that doesn't so much make you fear him as loathe him.
Yeah, oh no, for sure. And I think that something about the new atheist was just such bourgeois suburban atheism, right? It was. And I felt like
it was the atheism of the well-fed and
exactly
with good retirement plans.
And there's this snarky Sunday school kid trying to be fresh, aspect of it, where it was always like, did you ever wonder if Mary gave birth? They kind of like, okay, the attempt to be shocking, I found, and failing desperately at it.
Well, apparently it shocks Tomists that you could say that the God of a lot of Hebrew scripture is a problematic character if you read it literally, but most Christians are aware of this. So.
Oh, well, I remember there was I watched the Bill Maher movie, the atheistic movie he did like 15 years ago, and he was talking to I don't know who he was, if he was a priest or a theologian. It was a guy at the Vatican who he was encountering on the street, and he was interviewing him. And he was like, you mean to say you don't believe in a magical man in the sky? And the priest was like, no. And he was like, see, there's even atheists here. And I was like, there's so much. This is just an exercise in category mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, I have no I don't despise Bill Maher, but on this topic, yes, let's admit he's anything but a genius.
No, I pitied him more than despised him.
No, no, no. The reason for disliking Dawkins is he's also a horrible human being. I mean, he just,
Yes. And the amazing thing with Dawkins is at one time he's not an untalented writer in his earliest scientific writing.
Yeah, well, yeah, but he was an untalented thinker, which kind of took the joy out of it. Because you go back, you read The Selfish Gene, you realize the entire thing consists in a set of metaphors that are so inept that you don't actually need to know the science to know they're wrong. But then when you do know the science, I mean, really, when you realize how how out of date that book was even when it appeared, it's kind of painful. But you're right. I mean, he had a gift for communicating things. I don't think you would call him. I mean, he's not a beautiful writer. He's not someone you don't find there specimens of prose that stand out quite as much as his admirers imagine they do. But you do find some good passages there, and on the whole, you don't come away from his book thinking, "Oh, that was laborious," except the stupid ideas, isn't it? But the prose. So I give him credit. It's not like reading Daniel Dennett, who's just much more intelligent, though willfully stupid. I mean, I've never known how a man that intelligent can have devised so many stupid things to believe in. But my God, what a bad writer! I mean, I don't know how Dennett. I mean, he has a gift for taking 10,000 words to say something that should take 20. And
out of all of them, Hitchens was the best writer.
Oh, yeah. Probably. He was also the best human being in many ways. Yeah. I mean, I was supposed to debate Christopher. I was supposed to debate Hitchens the very year that the debate was being set up at, I don't even remember now. Maybe it was Columbia. It was, but George Stephanopoulos was they were hoping would be the moderator. And the thing that was interesting as the date didn't approach, because then of course it turned out he had the esophageal cancer and they couldn't go off. Is there was a real pathos there. I mean, that book he wrote was just, every page there's one historical. I mean, the conceptual errors.
God is not great yet.
But the number of historical errors are so egregious. I mean, and things like that don't even make sense if you have any concept of history. Like he suggests that Augustine was very fond of the myth of the wandering Jew, which would have been very precocious of him, since it would have obliged him to be fond of a story that hadn't appeared and wouldn't for 7 or 8 centuries.
Yeah, I was going to say.
But it's just the notion that Hitchens had such a hazy notion of late antiquity that he could imagine that legend could have existed in the 4th or 5th centuries. I mean, it's just you have to have an almost total ignorance of the time to understand the social situation. The myth of the wandering Jew is very much a myth that could only evolve within medieval Europe, in which there's a certain condition of Jews in an unhappy condition in the context of an entirely Christianized Europe. But anyway, but the thing is, back to you then, because we've now over to the new atheists, and it's easy to abuse them. But again, because as I say, this fascination is there, and I don't see how it cannot be there, because in a sense, it's always not just a theme, but in a sense, I agree with Steiner, it's the theme of the arts. There's a reason why great composers, on the whole, need some sort of religious structure of imagination, for instance. There's a very few hard and fast atheists among composers. Yeah, you get them. Like Werner Henze was a Marxist. Vaughan Williams was a bit skeptical. He did neither believe nor didn't believe. But generally,
Vaughan Williams. Huh? He composes like a believer, though. Vaughan Williams.
Oh, yeah. Well, you see, the thing is, he loved. He's sort of more of a think almost with the temperament of a late Victorian, someone who does not hate the faith he can't entirely embrace.
Yeah.
He's lamenting it. But there are others of his time, his contemporaries, like in Britain, like Robra, who were very devoutly Christian. Yeah, but no, I mean, it's true that you wouldn't know it. Why wouldn't you know it? Because the thematic material that inspired him was still about the transcendence of common experience, the search for the truth of God. And this is what I mean in the arts. What Updike meant is, you look at someone like Philip Roth. You couldn't find a more adamantly atheist, right? And yet he couldn't stop talking about it. If he couldn't, he may not have believed in God, but he believed in the absence of God with an almost fanatical devotion.
Yeah, I think I wrote an essay once about, right after Roth died, that was about, because I think you're absolutely correct to identify that sort of obsession with the numinous in Roth, even though he's ostensibly an atheist. And I always think about the conversion of the Jews, the story from his first book, From Goodbye Columbus and Other Stories. And this is the one in which, I don't know if you remember the story or not, but just to kind of quickly recap it. There's a kid in a Hebrew school class who's punished by the rabbi because he speaks out of turn all of the time. And later on in the story, he goes outside, and he gets under the roof of the synagogue, and he threatens to jump off unless they get down and admit certain things. And one of them is that they have to basically have his 10, 11-year-old's understanding of the Christian formulation, right? I believe that God could be born of a woman, blah, blah, whatever it's phrased as by Roth. And I think that this is and I skipped a couple scenes. I haven't read it in several years, but I thought what was so fascinating about it is it's not, obviously he is kind of satirizing some social aspects of the community in which he grew up in. He's not writing a work of Christian apologetics, of course, which is something that I had to explain to my students when I taught this 15 years ago. But I do think he's doing something fascinating about interrogating that absence of God and kind of feeling the absence of God in a way so intensely that it almost becomes a presence. And I don't know if I would necessarily ascribe that as my own kind of way of approaching belief, but I'm sympathetic to it. And I think at times I have felt in that way. But for me, for the literary writers that I'm most drawn to, if they are going to be atheists, I want a particular class of atheists, and I think that that's what always is so disappointing about more pedestrian forms of atheism is I want an atheism that takes God seriously, if that makes sense. And so there are those types of writers, I think, that can express that sort of paradoxical interrelationship of faith and doubt, and I think that they can be rewarding in a particular way.
Well, to be honest, though, that's there's a kind of salutary hygiene in that kind of atheism anyway, because as you mentioned earlier, there are those who actually believe, though, that have this sort of crude picture of God that Bill Maher seems to think, for instance, is the norm, and. In those moments, it's good to turn to a Nietzsche, to take the most extreme example.
Yeah.
And remember, that if you're going to think of God in this way, then that comes with all the encumbrances of believing in a giant magical being.
Yeah.
Within rather than the transcendent God. Which, causes, first of all sorts of philosophical problems. This picture of God obviously is crude, but it also, puts you in relationship to a being who has a lot to answer for, as opposed, someone that you think is just a reactive psychological agent in the way that another human being is involved in the world as a character in the action, but not as the transcendent creator, but that's a different issue. I mean, there we'd be wandering into all sorts of metaphysical claims that I like to avoid. One of the reasons I don't have these conversations generally, these recorded conversations with professional theologians, is they always want to hop in the saddle of their favorite metaphysical hobby horse and gallop it around the paddock for a while, and so I try to avoid that. But it is interesting to me in many ways, though, this approach. I'm trying to remember I keep trying to remember the term you use, because I myself quoted in here. Unfortunately, they took that bit of my endorsement off the back of the volume, so now I can't remember what is it you called it, something poetic.
In terms of my unbelief?
No. Your neither your belief nor your unbelief. It's, Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. Lord, I don't believe, help thou my unbelief. In the case of some, no, it was the term you used for the kind of criticism you want.
Oh, Orphic criticism.
Thank you. Very good. It was Orphic. Okay, I was afraid of it, because I knew it wasn't Gnostic, but Orphic is close enough. But Orphic, there you have the oracular aspect as well. The poet slain by the Maenads, who then, for those who aren't aware of this, the poet who, recapitulating the oldest mysterious religious tale of all, ventures into the realm of death to rescue the beloved and fails, or succeeds, one or the other. His case fails. But then also the poet who's torn apart by the Maenads, and his head becomes the source of prophecy. Right?
I kind of like the, it wasn't my intention when I came up with the phrase for Orphic criticism, but I like the idea of kind of the danger in finding the beloved is kind of being comparable to the danger in interpreting things one way or the other, right? I think with Orphic criticism, I feel like I was very much freed by the economic situation in higher ed to not have to just write about literature in a way that would get me a job and get me tenure, since I will never have an academic job or tenure, and I could just be like crazy. And that was kind of my intent with Orphic criticism, because on the one hand, from just academic training, I come out of the same sort of literary critical tradition that everyone my age does who has done graduate work in literary study, and so it's a lot of French theory and assorted other things, cultural studies. And I'm not opposed to any of those approaches at all, in a lot of ways. And I think some people...
Well, don't you know it's part of the cultural politics of the right to attack it all indiscriminately?
Oh, for sure. So. For sure, yeah. I mean, I was amazed to me when critical theory becomes like a part of the... I mean, I guess it was always part of the culture wars back to the 80s in some ways, but to hear people talking about Adorno and Horkheimer in this kind of conspiratorial way, and they just...
Oh, right. Yes, they're part of
it's surreal. I mean, it was like, I don't think...
What's the phrase that what's his name? Jordan...
when they call it cultural Marxism or something, that
the
hobby, this bizarre...
I saw bits of the debate with Zizek, and listening to the idiotic defense of that. That was embarrassing. I mean,
that was rough to watch, where Peterson admitted to having only read the Wikipedia entry for the Communist Manifesto.
And well, I mean, I think it's clear. I don't follow much of his stuff, but the few times I've seen him comment on philosophical figures in print, it's clear that he's read the backs of a lot of books.
Yeah.
But there's clearly not a guy who does. And though Zizek is a performance artist and all that, he actually is quite brilliant and knows what he's talking about, however you feel about him.
I have such a soft spot for Zizek.
Huh? I'm sorry?
I have a huge soft spot for Zizek.
Yeah, so do I. As a matter of fact. I think he's actually one of the truly interesting readers of Hegel in the world today.
His turn towards Christianity, Zizek, too, I found to be...
I know, it's funny, is it's sort of by way of figures like G.K. Chesterton, which I find amusing, because, of course, I'm just the opposite. When I was a kid, I was, G.K. Chesterton, fine apology. Now I find Chesterton very hard to take. One is just the sheer pervasiveness of the anti-Semitism. You find it you'll be reading a Father Brown story, and then you'll find some damn lie about the Middle Ages, and it just gets sickening after a while. And then people say, oh, he redeemed himself at the end by criticizing the Nazis. And then you go and look and find that he accused the Nazis of being too Jewish in their thinking,
Oh my God, Jesus.
So, and plus I get tired of the paradoxes because they aren't really that clever after a while. Two or three of them are, but when you get to the 16th trillionth one, you realize that this is just a cheap trick.
Yeah.
And I have to say this, as much as when I was like 14, I could read The Everlasting Man or something and say, oh yeah, this makes sense. But now, if someone told me that he had read that and that had converted him to Christianity, I would just think, you poor oaf. These aren't good arguments. These are arguments for people who already believe, but they aren't real. And so it's funny to me that Zizek has a real, he's made me go back there. Maybe there's more there than now, because I'm in reaction against Chesterton.
Yeah.
Maybe he sees something I don't. Anyway, that was painful to watch. And so the cultural Marxism thing, we can just.
I think for me, the Orphic criticism thing was less, it wasn't a reaction to critical theory at all. I mean, I have, I read all of the standard, Foucault, Derrida, Levinas, whatever, the whole coterie of folks, were drilled into us when I was in graduate school. But Orphic criticism, I didn't see as I just see it as something entirely different. And I don't even know if criticism is the right word for it so much as what was curious to me about our experience of literature is as readers, is how strange and mysterious literature actually is. And I've just found it interesting how rarely that is ever acknowledged in an academic setting. And that might be because acknowledging it doesn't produce novel or useful interpretations or something. But there's a way in which we just kind of don't touch the weirdness of literature.
Well, I mean, I find this in all the studies of the arts too. I mean, I have art departments that will talk about art that is saturated in religious themes without ever addressing why or how or what those themes are. I once a lecturer in the art department at the University of Virginia state with clear conviction that the ancient world, the ancient Greco-Roman world, people didn't really believe in their gods. That this was, more just sort of a cultural thing. Now, aside from the encyclopedic ignorance of antiquity it takes to say something like that, I mean, not to know, especially in late antiquity, how absolutely God-obsessed the world was, and how pervasive the divine and the daemonian in both its good and its bad aspects were understood as being. You had someone who's just, what he was saying was, there were these ancient people who just one day said, well, we need a mythology. So let's invent it as if, the way Tolkien wrote.
The Marvel movies or something.
Or the Marvel movies, something, and make up a mythology that, isn't true, but we just need one because we like myth. As if this was not a profoundly religious culture, these weren't. And so that you could detach that obvious fascination with hunger for, at times, obvious obsession with the transcendent and the numinous as just a set of motifs, like someone doing still lifes of pears.
Well, it's one of the things that I noticed with how we teach literature is, I think in academic English departments, even post high theory, we're all the inheritors of kind of that new critical recourse to the text alone.
The well-wrought urn.
Exactly, yeah, of rigorous close reading. And I have to say, as a strategy, close reading is intrinsic. It's so important, and I love it. I think that I think it's one of the unique things which the study of literature kind of gives to the wider humanities. But I think sometimes the tool is mistaken for the object of study. And I would note that when we're talking about literature with our students, with our undergrads, they tended to talk about literature much more the way anyone talks about literature, which, for example, we'd finish a novel and they'd say, what do you think happens after the novel ended, right? Well, from a new critical perspective, that's a meaningless question.
Right,
nothing happened.
Nothing
Novels,
happened.
yeah, they're not real and the novel ended and that's that. But of course, the fact that question, one is capable of thinking in that way, I think just evidences the innate kind of weirdness and beauty of literature, that an adept artist, an adept writer is able to create a world and a consciousness that seems so viscerally real that people think of them as those characters as if they were real people, right? And there's something that seems to me, and I don't know if it's a metaphor or if I mean it literally, it probably depends on the day, but there's something that seems very magical about that, or it's kind of like an art of conjuration, as I say in the book.
Yes, we both use that word too often, probably.
I know it's one of my. I want to do a study of what words I most misuse, and I'm sure conjuration is up there.
But let me point out okay.
Oh no, I'm sorry. We're going to ask.
I was also asked. I was going to say. I was going to wax. I was going to wax sage here, as of course the problem is that, of course, especially with literature. I mean, it's true of all the arts. But yeah, you can do the close reading and isolate the text from its surrounding world. But of course, then nothing actually exists in isolation, and you have no idea what you study half the time. What I find particularly galling at times in the people I know in certain English departments, but also critical volumes of certain works of literature, what you discover is that there are whole worlds of reference and meaning that are invisible to the critic because he or she has no grounding in that culture, and especially in its religious. It's what was. I mean, I don't know. I have seen. I think it was a Penguin critical edition of one of George Eliot's novels. I don't remember which one it was, in which there's a reference to the unforgivable scene, to which the footnote helpfully supplied by our educated critic was that he had no idea what this was a reference to, but might be a reference to desecration of a crucifix.
Oh my God! Really?
I have seen people try to come, and it gets absurd when you have people writing about Melville or Milton or George Herbert or Blake with no education. This is a story I like telling because it's just minimal study. Now, of course, at least we have the internet. You can Google some of these things, I think. But years ago, I was sitting and listening to two people at the English department at UVA. They were both interested in the Romantic poets, talking about Blake, and they were talking specifically about Songs of Innocence, and they were talking specifically about the poem called "The Echoing Green," and they were arguing about whether or not in the Songs of Innocence there are any adumbrations of the songs of experience and of darkness and of death, or whether they're absolutely pure of this. Now, one guy was getting this right and saying, no, there are adumbrations, and the other was getting it wrong, but neither of them knew why. And what was funny is, I don't know if you know the story, I mean, know the poem, but the way it ends is the children are out playing on the echoing green, but their sports end at the end of day, right? And it's, so the little one's weary, no more can be merry, the sun does descend and our sports have an end. Round the laps of their mothers, many sisters and brothers, like birds in their nests, are ready for rest. And then the very last little couplet, the cute little childish couplet is, and sport no more seen on the darkening green. That's it. It's not the echoing green, it's the darkening green. Now, darkening alone should tell you something. But the funny thing is, for Blake, when he wrote it, anyone raised as I was as an Anglican, High Church Episcopalian before the reform of the prayer book, and it's changed to the New English version of the Bible, which is unreadable. The prayer book, it was the old Coverdale Psalter. Yeah, the Coverdale Psalter from that. And everyone knew, everybody in England had heard. I mean, the Psalter is something everyone knew. That was something that people actually read aloud at home in their prayers. And that phrase, no more seen, is a very famous one. It comes from Psalm 39. It's the last two verses. For I am a stranger with thee and a sojourner, as all my fathers were. O spare me a little that I may recover my strength before I go hence and be no more seen. The phrase be no more seen is a reference to death. Now, I'm not, this is something you pull out and, they should have known this, but actually they should have known this.
Yeah.
Talking about Blake, they must know that they're, but again, but the more ridiculous examples, things like talking about Milton. I years ago, in fact, I think the first academic article I ever published was on Milton. I think that's right.
Oh, really? Huh.
Yeah, and
that's my next book. Is on Milton.
Yeah, I must see it to judge it, but I assume it'll be good. If it's not, I won't tell you. But,
we'll see.
We'll see. But it was just how much of the scholarship I saw talking about when Milton is clearly alluding to fairly well established and easily researched aspects of Christian intellectual culture. They're completely unaware of them. One of the arguments I saw going back and forth in print among some fairly famous Milton scholars was about whether or not Milton really was an Arian or not, and whether he wrote De Doctrina Christiana. And I went to both the translations available of that. There's a point where the whole point about which I think he did write it. There are any number of reasons why I think he clearly was the author, and trying to pretend he wasn't is, the religious
consensus, I think, today, right?
Yeah, I think people religiously. But there's a point in it's written in Latin, as you know, and there's a point where he's talking, in order to make the Arian point, all the limitations and of attribution, all the human limitations ascribed to Jesus or ascribed to Christ by the text. And then he goes on to say, and you can't understand this by reference to some kind of communicatio idiomatum. Now, anyone who studied theology knows that that's a Christological term regarding whether the human and divine idioms can be interchangeable when talking about Christ or not. Apodosis is communicatio there means whether when speaking of Christ and his humanity, you can also, or in his divinity, you can attribute that which seems human to the divine and that which seems divine to the human. There's a very old issue in Christology, and all they had to do was look up communicatio idioma. No one got the point. Both the translators and all the critics just thought what he meant was some attempt at metaphorical speech, that the reason he talks this way is he's communicating idiomatically, and that's how it's translated. And it opened up to me the thought that it really is the whole world from which that literature emanates more and more withdraws from our consciousness. Now, at one level, you can't do anything about that. You can't demand that people become scholars of Christian intellectual history in order to be readers. But you can demand that people who read books by authors who were deeply immersed in Christian intellectual history make some attempt to see the importance of that for understanding what they wrote.
I think that there's sometimes
Paradise Lost without any interest in the different ways in which the specific religious concerns and hermeneutical concerns of Milton's actually rather independent-minded approach to Christianity were concerned, leaves you just pretending that you're talking about the poem Paradise Lost, but not really. You're talking about the language used, and even then, not really.
I think that one of the things, this is part of a legacy of not taking religion seriously on its own terms in academia. And I will say that, my own academic trainings in 17th century lit. And I think for the most part, I mean, a lot of 17th century lit scholars, you can't avoid religious debates, right? You just can't not be aware of it in some sense, or else you're just not doing your job right. But I have been surprised by the degree of just strange ignorance that will sometimes emerge around some discussions. So, like thinking about Herbert, for example, a big critical debate over the past two generations has really been how Protestant was Herbert. Was there a degree of crypto Catholicism or something there? That's the
I
old
tend
joke.
to think there was. I mean, of course,
Yeah,
you're talking about Anglicans, so I mean,
exactly.
you're always in a very murky area there.
Exactly. Although and in a lot of ways, Herbert was probably a pretty not a stern Calvinist, but in kind of the pre-Restoration Church of England, kind of more reformed than maybe people later in the century would have been.
Yeah, but this is the curious thing about Anglicanism. I can speak as a child of that.
Yeah,
that gloriously indecisive tradition.
it's true.
Is that you can be both very Catholic and very Calvinist in different aspects.
That's true.
Faith.
It's the glory of latitudinarianism, right?
Or in my case, very anti-Calvinist and very oriented towards the Greek fathers at an early age, but with a love of all things English.
With the Herbert debate, I'm sorry. I remember I was talking to a very, very respected and in some ways very incisive critic of Herbert, but there was like an aspect of just the sort of theology behind transubstantiation that the scholar didn't, and like the differing views on it. And it was like such a basic thing that I was kind of shocked. Or another example, and this wasn't about Herbert, I can't remember what we were talking about, but it was another scholar of the early modern period who just very authoritatively said to me, well, because the transubstantiation in the Catholic Church is like a symbol. And I was like, say what? It's symbolic in the Catholic. I was like, for this, people burned at the stake for like, this is not a small.
Right. Again. And I feel the same way about people who try to understand the art of the ancient world. It isn't a complaint that people have stopped caring much about Christian. I just mean in general, the notion that you can extract the products, the arts from not only their material conditions, but from their cultural conditions, and the spiritual world in which they evolved is just, to my mind, insane. You've created an artificial object by isolating it from its spiritual ecology. And with me, of course, it's more because I understand the arts as such, as having a kind of inexorability in their openness to the spiritual, to the divine, even when they resist it. That there's something in the very work of the arts, the magnum opus, the great work of the. I don't mean a magnum opus. I just mean the great work of transformation that occurs in the arts, to use the alchemical version of the term. Is most definitely a preoccupation with the transcendent horizon. And it can't not be, because, to be honest, it's the one, we're very good at distracting ourselves from life and distracting ourselves from distraction, because life is pretty dull for most of us most of the time. But in most forms of distraction, there's a surfeit. There comes a point where you can only watch, you can only binge on so many Netflix series. When no matter who you are, you're going to find yourself wearied by it, fatigued. The hunger to create, the hunger for the arts in those moments taken root, never actually seems to me to lead to that same surfeit, because it's not just distraction. It's not just something consciously we do to distract ourselves from death. That at the heart of it, the reason that it goes on, and that we need to create, and that we need to love what's created when it's something that surpasses our expectations. When we suddenly encounter, so we're in the gallery, we may not even be art lovers, and suddenly we encounter a canvas, and for reasons we don't understand, it affects us at a level that's not just psychological, but in a sense genuinely numinous. It is because
that's right.
the very venture of the arts is always already that kind of spiritual, that kind of engagement with the horizon beyond the horizon. You know.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. I think it comes out in both the act of creating and the act of experiencing creation. And I think there's something, right in that writing is what I'm most familiar with. Obviously, there's still something mysterious about the process, right? Like, I think that we can illuminate works by recourse to an author's biography or sociological considerations or formal considerations of the text itself or whatever. But when you're actually kind of in the process of writing, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, there can be that kind of sense that you don't quite know what's going to happen, a sense of maybe.
No, I mean, I think that anyone who's, writing seriously, again, we're not talking about journalism.
Yeah.
I hope that if I'm forgotten for everything else I've ever written, I'm remembered for one line, that'll get into books of quotations at the beginning of an essay that I started with. Journalism is the art of translating abysmal ignorance into execrable prose. So I'm always.
You're going to get me in trouble with that.
I'm sure there are good journalists out there. I mean the ones who, but
for sure.
But let's be honest. The intellectual journalist is sort of like the prostitute with the heart of gold. It's something, an object of fond fantasy for a certain kind of man, but is more a fiction than anything else. It's the truth is though, when you're really writing, I think anyone has had this experience of being written through.
Yes.
Now, in the sense that there's something in me that's more ultimate than me, that's seeking something else that's more ultimate than I am. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sometimes when one is willing to fully give oneself over, I think, to that force, it can take some of the anxiety that surrounds writing. It becomes like a process of discovery, in a way, more even than of invention. Although maybe those are the same thing.
And in every form. Well, that I also write fiction, and more than has appeared. And in fact, actually. Had life taken me down a different road, that's probably all I'd have ever done. It was just, more financial things that they got other things in print first. But there have been experiences that have been positively uncanny. And the things I think that were the best of what I've done in that vein, there's a very short story called The True Helen, which is 1,600 words at most. Or a book called a story called The House of Apollo. First of all, both of which started as dreams. And I'm very superstitious about dreams, actually. It comes out again and again. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah.
But there was a real uncanniness in the experience of writing those stories, both because they came out perfectly in the sense that they came out perfectly in line with what I wanted them to be. Usually we're dissatisfied at the end of our work and always want to go. In this case, not so. But the other thing is, that were two examples in which I really thought I was not so much writing as being written through. And I don't think we should discount that. You can do the Freudian thing and talk about the unconscious. You can be like Julian Jaynes and so on. Of course, the right hemisphere in the causeway to the left hemisphere.
That's such a weird book. I kind of have a sympathy for it, but it is a strange.
Well, I have a fascination with it because it's so ostentatiously wrong, while almost
it can't be disproven. It's so not.
Well, I think actually it can, because I think you can show that without consciousness in a reflective sense, there are any number of things that you literally can't do. That we can't be functionalist parent. But that's my book on philosophy of mind. That's a different world from the one I'm right. So I'll stay away from that. But what's funny about it, of course, say this now, is that something that apparently never occurred to Julian Jaynes was, this is why you need Marxists, okay, in your material conditions. There's a reason why it's true that the Gilgamesh epic does not read like a 19th century novel of personal psychology. Part of that is because when you're recording your epic in cuneiforms on clay tablets, the medium somewhat limits the range of expressiveness and how much time you have. It never occurs to him that, ancient epics show signs of,
You can't do Middlemarch on 80 tons of clay.
Right. It just, it's impracticable to say the least.
Yeah.
But anyway, putting all that aside, you can say all of these things, and there may be some truth in them. They don't have to be discriminated from one another unless you believe the unconscious is just sealed within your skull, which I don't. Obviously, I believe that there's a kind of spiritual community that binds all things together in which we participate. So the deliverances of the unconscious might also be deliverances from beyond this small, pitiable psychological ego that I am. But the experience was uncanny. I mean, it is just, in the case of both those stories, and I've had other times, there was also something else I recently wrote. It hasn't been published yet, so I don't. I take actually moments like that to be indicative, though, of a general truth. I think there are moments when we become aware of things in particular because our minds are particularly open at that point to an experience. But what one's experiencing is tacitly the case at all times. It's like those moments when we suddenly become aware of the uncanniness of existence. Because we're not thinking about anything in particular, suddenly we're able to think about everything in terms of the sheer strangeness of its being there. And I think in the arts, there's always, when they're real arts, obviously there's plenty of meretricious trash and, fan fiction on this, the latest Star Trek series or whatever. But the real that's going on at all times, that spirit is speaking to spirit. That something in us innately, naturally oriented towards a realm of infinite intelligibility and spiritual truth and meaning, whether it's there or not. I believe it is, but is what generation after generation, age after age, makes us crave these acts of creation and appreciation in a way that goes far beyond the mere animal need for or the mere organic need for distraction.
Oh, and I think that there's been.
And I see you as participating in that knowledge, whether you say it that way or not. The reason why I like the things that interest you in the critical work you write interest me as well, is for just that reason. Is I think that's the proper way to understand the mysterious element in artistic creativity.
Oh, that's incredibly kind of you to say, I think, and that's definitely I think part of what obsesses me with my writing about literature is that sort of yearning for the transcendent that literature at its best exemplifies or gives expression to, or allows us to kind of dwell within, Sorry, I heard my dog barking next. Now she's complaining about
another sound for which I have infinite patience.
That's true, yeah. Well, yeah.
The voice of the dog is heard in the land. So did you like Roland and Moonlight? Were you one of the recommenders? I'm trying to remember. Yeah, you.
No, but I wrote a review for.
Oh, you wrote a review of it, right? Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
it was a good review.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I love. I'm a huge. I'm an advocate for dogs. I guess I would put it sort of.
Though, admittedly, it's not really a book about dogs, but it is.
Oh, for sure. For sure,
But did you like? This is what I have to ask you. My three, I think, favorite moment. Well, no, I would say my two favorite moments in the book are one where I, halfway between sleep and waking, think I have the vision of Roland as the Buddha on Vulture Peak about to deliver the Lotus Sutra.
Mm-hmm.
Which may be a great impiety. I've got to make sure none of the Nichiren Buddhists are offended by that.
Uh-huh.
But the other is his description of the epic, the Lyciad, the epic of his people.
I loved that. Yeah.
Yes, I think all my love of dogs somehow poured into that silly moment. And also the moment where he explains that dogs have guided our evolution originally because they were trying to achieve bacon in the motor car. But that's a different.
I mean, that made sense to me. I got that. I read Rolling in the Moonlight with my dog too, so she was in my presence most of the time.
Did she like it?
She did. She did. She's a little.
What's her name?
Her name's Molly, and she is a French bulldog.
I love French bulldogs. I love French bulldogs. They're the silliest looking creatures.
They're so amazing. Yeah, she's like a goblin gremlin thing.
Yeah, but
our son doesn't believe she's a dog. Actually, incidentally,
I'm not sure I believe
he's other dogs.
I think they come from a different dimension. I may feel that about all bulldogs, but the little French bulldogs and pugs too. I think
in Boston's to an extent.
I think they're like the fairy dogs or the fairy equivalent of dogs who got out of the realm of fairy and interbred with our dogs because they don't. How could this have come from a wolf?
I know, and she's very like, we with our son, we've been like, there's a dog and there's a golden retriever or something. He's like, dog. We're like, Molly's a dog, and he goes, no. Like, she's a dog. I swear to you. I think she's older than you. She's a dog. He's like, no.
She's an elf of some kind.
Yeah, she's a goblin or something, a benevolent goblin, mostly benevolent. Goblin.
My voice probably dying away now. I said I was going to try to keep this within bounds. When we cut out the moments of inactivity, we might be kind of close to where these things go over. But I promised I would tell my Harold Bloom story, just because it's strange. We late in his life that he reached out and wrote to me because he'd read the New Testament translation and was very pleased with it. I think in part because of all the footnotes that have to do with the powers and principalities and angels of the time. I mean, I very much, the scholarship of that translation, I tried to acquaint the readers with the spiritual world of late antiquity and of the Second Temple Judaism of the time and so on and so forth. And this especially pleased him, but also there were things he liked about the introduction. So it was because of that he really got to know me and I got to know him. And lovely man, wonderfully extravagant, excessive in all the ways that everyone knows that he was excessive.
Falstaffian.
Well, yes. It's the sequel to the Pooh Perplex. I can't remember what it's called, in which he's satirized as Orpheus Bruno, in which he presents himself as Falstaff and Pooh Bear at once, as an Orphic seer and all that. Okay, well, all of that's fun, but his fascination with Gnosticism and with the religious dimensions of art and with sort of Northrop Frye's approach to Blake and all that, to my mind, was very healthy. Whether you agreed with what he was doing all the time is a different matter. But he too understood that here there be angels and devils and all sorts of things. Like the devils you tried to keep your distance from in that last big book of yours, but you might have been courting their attention, by the way. You have to be careful about that thing. You speak the devil's name and he doth appear and all that,
I keep the book in the closet, so it's not on my shelf.
Yeah, I used it to prop up a credenza, but no. Sorry. No. I think I lent it to my nephew recently. But anyway, putting all that aside and putting your dabbling in the world of darkness aside.
Necromancy.
So anyway, I wrote to him and you see how we hadn't talked for a while, and he said he had just read That All Shall Be Saved, the book on universalism. Now, this in itself seemed bizarre to me. I was like, why was he reading that? That's, because I strictly discriminate the theological stuff from the stuff I really care more about, which, to be honest, is the fiction and the literary criticism and all that, and those things I care more about, to be honest. The theology is to me sort of the day work I do to because I know something about it. People like some of it, but why he would be reading that, I didn't know. But what was funny was the way he put it is, I read it. I found it deeply moving in many ways, but I must say that I do not agree. Unfortunately, and this is what he said, and this was late in the day, he said, I'm not feeling it all well today, so we'll have to revisit that when we can later. Huh. That was it. And the next morning I found out he'd passed away. So that may very well have been one of the last email exchanges he had, which he deserved better than to have that exchange with me be his last. But so I hope it was with someone more entertaining. But what was interesting is that there's something strange about it, is that I had to think, not what does he disagree with, it's what possibly could he agree with? I mean, what relevance would it have to him at all? It's entirely And I will go to my grave probably wondering and hoping that I'm right about this, and on the other side of the grave he'll be able to explain that remark to me. But it was interesting. It's not, I admit, the best Harold Bloom story out there, but it's the one I've got.
It's a good one. I think there's something, and that book, All of Us Who Save, that came out just shortly before he passed, right? Like a couple months before. Or I'm trying to think.
I think, because he was. It was my latest when he read it. I think. He was there at Yale, and he and I had the same editor, Jennifer Banks, and I think she gave a copy to him because he was still praising the New Testament translation. I know I got like very favorable notices at various parts in his last book. So, he said nice things about the translation and such. And even, strangely enough, about an essay I had written on David Jones. So, I mean, he was reading, I flattered, he was reading me widely. But that last remark, it's like, and I realized that, his field of interests, he may have been far more interested in things that would never have occurred to me than I realized, but maybe in general that's what's necessary for a literary critic. He should have this kind of, or she should have this kind of omnivorous interest.
Bloom is one of those great, I think as a literary critic, there's a lot that people can say and have said about Harold Bloom, but his writings on religion, at least from the perspective of, use the word healthy, and I think you're right, kind of, it's healthy how he was willing to view religion and literature as inextricably connected in a way that goes beyond even just influence.
Right. No, he understood that in some mysterious way they're both engaged in the same realm of otherwise ineffable desires.
And his writings on religion. I mean, I think the American religion is one. I don't know if his argument is right or not, but it's one of the most interesting books on American faith.
Yeah, I mean, I of course, I have my own opinions of how we talk about Gnosticism regarding, I think the scholarship on Gnosticism has been universally questionable since the 18th century, but he was definitely onto something real there. You could call it Orphic or Gnostic in some sense or another.
Yeah.
But the way in which the American evangelical world especially has translated what he calls Christianity into a mystery religion of personal rescue through relation with a somewhat docetic savior, maybe in some ways, but I mean that's a different conversation. But nonetheless, I mean, I thought, he was right about this in broad outline. And one thing he did tell me near the end is he would have rewritten that. He would have written that book very differently because he knew more about the scholarship of ancient Gnosticism now. He learned a lot from Bentley, Leighton, and others. So my voice is deserting me happily. Also, we're at the end, I think, of the time. So I thought we could end here. It's if that's all right with you.
This was spectacular, and thank you again for your tremendous patience with my son's.
It doesn't require any patience on my part. Actually, as I say, it brings back old memories. And I'm much more sentimental than I give on. You know. So let me stop the recording and say,
Okay.
We'll first say goodbye to all out there in TV
Thank you.
land.
Goodbye, everybody.
We just stop the recording.